Well, good evening. It's very good to be in this beautiful space, and also at a Resurgence event, because I've been reading Resurgence and writing for Resurgence for as long as I can remember, almost. A long time, anyway. The subject of science and spiritual practices is a new one in a way, because in the past people thought of these as completely separate domains. But we're in an extraordinary new situation today. Regular religious observance in Western Europe has declined to an extraordinary degree. The percentage of the population who regularly attend church or other places of worship is now about 5%. That means 95% of people in Britain don't have a regular traditional religious practice. And in a survey last year, for the first time, more than 50% of the population described themselves as having no religion. This is very, very unusual in the history of humanity. Yet, at the same time, it's not as if people have lost interest in spirituality. There's been a tremendous growth in all sorts of spirituality, including yoga and meditation, in the modern world, and a great deal of interest in it. And also, and this is one of the points of my talk, in recent decades, a series of scientific studies on spirituality of a kind that never took place before. In 2012, a massive volume was published called the Handbook of Religion and Health, about that thick, cost about £150. I felt I had to buy a copy because it's so relevant to what I'm doing research on. It's a fascinating compilation summarizing the result of about 2,000 peer-reviewed scientific papers on religion and spiritual phenomena since the year 2001, when the first edition of this handbook was published, with another 2,000 papers summarized in it. What these results show is that people who have regular religious or spiritual practices are happier, healthier, and live longer than those that don't. These are kind of average figures. But there's overwhelmingly clear evidence that these practices are good for people. Out of the papers that they looked at in the handbook, only 4% showed negative effects of religious practices, and those were for people who felt exceptionally guilty and belonged to religions that made them feel even guiltier, or people who were in a state of great religious conflict, torn between different religions. But for most people, the effects were extremely positive. Now, this situation has not been lost on atheists. And some of you may have read a book that came out a few years ago by Alain de Botton, who's a well-known philosopher and also an atheist. He was raised atheist, he tells us in his book. He had two Jewish parents living in Zurich who were very, very committed atheists. And he said his parents treated anyone who evinced the slightest interest in religion as if they were suffering from a terminal degenerative disease, and never took them seriously thereafter. So he was brought up like that. And he says he's never questioned his atheist belief system, but he's not interested in fighting against religions. He just wants to know what happens in atheism 2.0. If you've given up all these religious practices, what do you do next? And in his book, Religion for Atheists, he points out that religious people, say you go to church once a week, you get to sing with other people. People who don't go to church often never get to sing with other people. If you go to part of a religion, you take part in festivals and your children take part in them. But if you don't, you miss out that dimension. You miss out the dimension of community, miss out the dimension of pilgrimage, and so on. He goes on through all these things, and he's now trying to reinvent religion for atheists, including the construction of an atheist temple in London, which he's able to fund himself, having inherited a £200 million trust fund. So That's one symptom of this. Another is the so-called new atheist Sam Harris in the United States, who's a virulent denouncer of religion, but Sam Harris has become a devoted meditator, and he's now giving online meditation courses. Susan Blackmore, who's a prominent British atheist, is a Zen meditator and has written a book advocating the practices of Zen. And there's even an atheist church, the Sunday Assembly, which started 3 or 4 years ago, and now has over 70 branches. And they meet on Sundays and they sing songs and tell uplifting stories. And they've even stopped calling it an atheist church. They now prefer to call it mystical humanism. So there's a very interesting move here of a kind of coming back to old style atheists rejected all of this, but the new style ones, this new generation, are actually quite interested in spirituality. So it's no longer an old division between religious and spiritual on one side and non-religious and non-spiritual on the other. The lines are much more blurred, and there are many people who are not religious but spiritual, and the percentage of atheists in the British population is about 13%. The percentage of people who go to church regularly is 5%. So that means that over 80% of people neither identify with atheism or complete rejection of religion and spirituality, nor are committed to a traditional religion. So there's the vast majority of people actually are open to the realm of the spirit, but not in its conventional forms. In this book, what I do is look at 7 different spiritual practices which have been investigated scientifically. And what I'm doing is looking at the scientific study of them, the historical background, and I end each chapter with suggestions as how you can take these up for yourself. Simple exercises that are easy to do, cost nothing, and anyone can incorporate into their lives. And the practices are gratitude, giving thanks, meditation, connecting with nature, relating to plants. That's really a kind of spillover from connecting with nature, but I'm so keen on plants and it wouldn't fit into the nature chapter, so there's a separate one on plants. Singing and chanting. This is something I've learned a lot about from my wife Jill Peirce, who has been giving for years chanting and singing workshops, and who's found a way of teaching these very fundamental spiritual practices in a way that works equally well for people who are religious and people who are non-religious. Rituals, which are common to all religious and secular traditions as well. And pilgrimage, which is undergoing an extraordinary resurgence at the moment. Well, these are the main topics, and I don't have time to talk about them all this evening, but I'm going to start with gratitude, and I'll just talk about 2 or 3 of them. There have been a lot of studies by positive psychologists of gratitude, and for those of you who don't know about the positive psychology movement, this is something that started in the late 20th century. A group of psychologists noticed that the great majority of psychology was about what makes people miserable. And not surprising, most psychotherapists see people who've got problems. But they wanted to find out what makes people happy. So they did studies to find out what makes people happy. And the initial studies were done where they had volunteers who had pagers, and at random times during the day there'd be a beep go off, and they had to write down what they were doing and how happy they felt on a 1 to 9 scale. And after this study had been done for a while, they looked at occasions when people felt happy. Quite a lot of situations were ones in which people felt happy. When they were absorbed in their work, dancing, involved in music, in a good conversation with friends, doing some activity in which they were engaged, sports, and so on. The common factor to all these different things was that when they were in a state of flow, they felt happy. when they were in a state of disconnection, when they felt bored, resentful, angry, disconnected, then they didn't feel happy. So one of the key things about happiness turned out to be being in the flow, in the state of flow. And one of the features about happy people that stood out very strongly was that happy people are grateful people. When they found that people who are grateful are happy, the critics said, well, of course they're grateful. That's because they're happy. That's why they're grateful. People who are unhappy aren't grateful because they're unhappy. So they then tried to work out, are they happy because they're grateful, or are they grateful because they're happy? So they started doing exercises using standard scientific methodologies. They had groups of volunteers divided into 3 at random. One group was asked to make a list of all the hassles and problems they'd encountered in the previous week. Another group was asked to write a story about something that happened in the previous week. And the third group was asked to make a list of the things for which they felt grateful in the previous week. And the people who'd made the list of being grateful, who'd counted their blessings, were measurably happier for days afterwards as a result of this, just thinking of the things for which they felt grateful. And the exercise that was the most effective of all was what they called the gratitude letter. People who wrote a letter to someone who'd helped them in their lives, to whom they'd never properly given thanks. For example, a teacher who'd been really important for them. So they wrote a letter to this person thanking them for what they'd done. And then they went to that person and read them the letter. And people who did that were measurably happier for 2 months afterwards. It had an enormous effect on their happiness. And this idea that gratitude enables people to feel more connected and happy is, of course, no news. I mean, all religions, and lots of people have known this forever, all religious services begin with thanksgiving. Christian hymns and psalms are very largely to do with giving thanks, and so they are in other religions. This practice of gratitude turns out to be now has the seal of approval of modern science, even though most of our grandmothers and other relatives knew all about it. And the opposite of being grateful is, of course, feeling ungrateful or entitled, feeling that you just deserve all this, it's yours by right, and if you don't get it, you complain. That's a very modern attitude, and partly the way we live separates us from those to whom we can feel grateful. If you buy food in a supermarket and you pay for it at an automatic checkout, there's no way you can give thanks to the people who've grown your food, prepared it, transported it, looked after it, made sure it's properly labelled, etc., etc. It's just a cash transaction. So overwhelming is this evidence that a lot of American companies have now taken this up, and some of them give self-help books about gratitude to their employees. This has led to a backlash. You might think there's nothing wrong with gratitude. Who could possibly complain about it? Well, there are some people who are complaining about it. One of them is the American writer Barbara Ehrenreich, who I think is a very good writer, and I like her books a lot. And I was very surprised when I saw her book Against Gratitude. It's called Smile or Die. And Barbara Ehrenreich points out that American corporations have discovered that if their employees feel grateful, they get on better with each other, they get on better with their customers, everyone's happier, and it's good for business. That's why they give them these self-help books about being grateful. But some of them have taken it further. When they're firing people, they employ positive psychology consultants to interview the people who are being fired, to point out to them what an incredible career opportunity is opening up for them, the prospect of an entirely new job with the choice of all sorts of new directions in which they could go, trying to induce them to feel grateful for being fired. Well, probably good if you are being fired to take it positively. But Barbara Ehrenreich thinks that this is being cynically exploited by corporations. And I think it is. But that doesn't mean that gratitude's a bad thing. The fact everything can be exploited doesn't prove it's a bad thing in itself. One of the things I suggest in my book, one of the practices I suggest of gratitude, is a very, very simple one, which is something that people have done throughout history in all cultures, which is giving thanks before meals, saying grace. I was brought up in my own family doing this, and in my college in Cambridge, Clare College, before every meal, every evening, when you go into hall, everyone's in their gowns, it's a formal hall, a gong goes, everyone stands up, and there's a long Latin grace, which is done every evening, as in other Oxford and Cambridge colleges. And you could think this is a mere formality, but actually it provides a pause before the meal in which you can just stop for a while, break off your conversation, a space in which there's the possibility of giving thanks or recognizing that you're about to eat a delicious meal and somebody's cooked it for you and somebody's grown that food, and there are a lot of people in the world without food, and we have a lot to be grateful for. A lot of people would feel self-conscious about old-style graces before meals in families, but in our family what we usually do is, when it's just the family, we hold hands silently so everyone can give thanks in their own way. If there are more people, someone says a grace, I usually do it. Or if big things like Christmas and big dinners, we sing a grace. There are a range of graces, really nice sung graces, which you can sing as rounds. And after doing that, everyone's just glowing. The whole atmosphere of the meal is completely different. If you don't do it, then there's that rather sort of awkward pause, and someone says, oh, do start, or it'll get cold, or perhaps, bon appetit. Or, and everyone used to do this. There was a thing about the TV series Downton Abbey, came out in the papers last year, and somebody asked, why is it that you never see them starting a meal? And the answer is because they would have, around the period of the First World War, in a big house like that, every meal would have started with a grace. So you couldn't show them starting the meal because it would have involved a grace, and that might have offended atheists in the viewing public. So they never had them starting a meal. So this is, in our secularized media, anything that's part of a traditional religious practice has been completely airbrushed out. You'd never guess that it ever existed. Anyway, this is a terribly simple practice, and just holding hands silently is the easiest way into this, and even with rebellious teenagers it works quite well, as I know from experience. And our sons, who are now more grown up, are perfectly happy with this. We've always done it all their lives, and we always do it at home. If it's just me and my wife, we just hold hands before every meal. It's a very, very simple thing, and it makes a difference. Now, let me come to meditation. Meditation is a practice in all religious traditions, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, where it's called contemplative prayer, been practiced in monasteries and convents since at least the 3rd century AD. It's present in the Sikh tradition, it's present among Sufis in the Muslim tradition. It's everywhere. And it's now extraordinarily popular in the modern world. Something like 18 million Americans now meditate. I'm guessing many people here will have meditated or do meditate. How many meditate now or have meditated? Well, I would say that's well over 90%. So I don't need to tell you what it's like, because everyone here knows something about it. But if you'd mentioned, when I was at school, I never heard the word meditation, or it meant thinking about things, if it meant anything. It wasn't really until the late 1960s that it was widely popularized. Before that it was known in esoteric circles to theosophists and so on, introduced from India in the 19th century. But a big surge in popularity happened in the early 70s. Late 60s, early 70s, from two sources really. One was mainly the Maharishi, Mahesh Yogi, transcendental meditation, and the other were various forms of Buddhist-type mindfulness meditation. And so many students were doing this in the early 70s, and people in universities, that in a couple of universities in Massachusetts, medical researchers got interested and started doing research on it. One of them, Herbert Benson, mainly studied the mantra-based techniques, like in the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's method, transcendental meditation, which I myself first did in 1971, so it was the first one that I tried myself. Herbert Benson did research on that, and John Kabat-Zinn, also in Massachusetts, started doing research on mindfulness meditation, which involves paying attention to the breathing or sensations in the body, not using a mantra. But both of them have rather similar effects. Benson found that meditation affected what he called the relaxation response. His best-selling book on it was called The Relaxation Response. He pointed out that all of us have, as part of our nature, which we share with animals, the adrenaline-based sympathetic nervous system activation when we're frightened. If something scary happens, your heart beats faster, adrenaline goes into your bloodstream, you get activated and ready to fight or to run away. And that's normal and natural, and we need it where we do find ourselves in dangerous situations. The opposite of the sympathetic nervous system is the parasympathetic nervous system, the other side of the coin of the autonomic nervous system. And that's to do with feeling relaxed. And you have to feel relaxed before you can make love or eat or go to the lavatory. If you're in an adrenaline type response, you're not going to feel very erotic. You're not going to feel as if you want to sit down to a relaxed meal. And it's hard to go to the lavatory too. Your energies and your whole physiology is focused on running away or dealing with the emergency. What Benson found was that many people in the modern world are chronically anxious. They're frightened all the time, even though when there's nothing much to be frightened of. So there's a kind of activation of this sympathetic nervous system in chronic anxiety. And when people meditated, the heartbeat slowed down, the stress levels decreased, cortisol levels in the blood went down, and basically you got the relaxation response. It disinhibited, it turned down the sympathetic nervous system and more activated the parasympathetic. Many other effects of meditation, lowering stress in all sorts of ways, people sleep better, and many studies have shown that people who meditate regularly are less prone to depression. In fact, this is now so well established that over the last 2 or 3 years in some parts of Britain, you can now get a prescription for meditation on the NHS. If you go to a psychiatrist with mild or moderate depression, some of them will prescribe meditation, which is an approved treatment. It's been shown in clinical trials that people who do meditation for depression get better, at least as well, and certainly cheaper, than those who are put on a course of Prozac or other antidepressant drugs. And of course, there are no side effects. So meditation is now medically approved. It's taught in many schools, it's in prisons, it's taught in many institutions, because it's proven to make people happier and healthier. There have also been many studies on the effects of meditation on the brain. It causes a decrease in activity of what's called the default mode network, which is the series of brain centers that link together that are activated when you're ruminating or worrying or thinking resentful thoughts and so on. And not surprisingly, that set of circuits in the brain becomes less active as people meditate. And you all know that if you meditate regularly, it's easier to let go of those thoughts. You can't suppress them, but by not hanging on to them, you can let them go. Meditation is about having another focus of attention, either the mantra or the breathing or sensations in the body, which enables you to let thoughts go through your mind like clouds going through the sky, and let them go without being drawn into them or attached to them. And of course, one does keep getting attached. I've been meditating on and off for over 40 years, and still, most of the time when I'm meditating, there are these trains of thought going through my mind. But it's a way of not being attached to them. So all of this is now very well studied scientifically. The effects are quite well known. Many people do it. There's a difference of opinion as to what's going on, though, because the reason people meditate in religious traditions, where it's been going on for millennia, is because they feel by meditating, by getting to the very basis of consciousness, the basis of the mind, you're connecting with the basis of all consciousness. The Hindus are the ones who put it most clearly. They think that Brahman, the ultimate consciousness of the universe, is the source of our own consciousness and of all consciousness within nature. And the basis of our own consciousness is Brahman, and when we can connect with the witnessing part of our consciousness, the consciousness through which things move, we're connecting with the very ground of consciousness itself, with the ultimate consciousness. And we're all part of it. The metaphor that they often use is of the moon being reflected in buckets of water. Every bucket of water you can see a reflection of the moon. It looks like lots of different moons, but actually they're all reflections of the same moon in each different container. And that's how they see our consciousness. So the point of it is to link to the ultimate ground of consciousness. In the Buddhist meditation methods, it's to link to that which is beyond all concept, nirvana, which is defined negatively, which is the ground of consciousness. In the Christian tradition, it's to link to the very being of God's consciousness itself. It's the same basic idea. But for materialists and atheists, it's not about that at all, because what makes materialists and atheists different from all religious and indeed most spiritual traditions is that they believe there is no consciousness out there. The universe is completely unconscious, made of unconscious matter. As I discuss in these dogmas of materialism in my book, The Science Delusion, and that there is no consciousness out there, it's just inside brains. It's in human brains and maybe higher animal brains, and liberal materialists will say, well, maybe worms and insects have a bit, but it's basically confined to brains. The whole of the rest of the universe is unconscious. So there's no way you can connect with a consciousness beyond yourself. There isn't any. So materialists think that what's happening when they're meditating is that they're just activating different parts of the brain and having these experiences, and it's all inside their heads. Now, most people who meditate don't spend much time worrying about what's really going on or what's the ultimate meaning of it. But if you do reflect on it, it does show quite a big difference between people who do it in a secular and a religious framework. And many people start in a secular framework and then move to a more spiritual point of view. I did myself when I started meditation in 1971. I was a card-carrying atheist. And one of the reasons I liked the transcendental meditation method was that they said you don't need to believe anything, just do it and see what you experience. And that is actually the point in this book that I'm making. All these spiritual experiences that I'm talking about are things you can just do by experience. You don't have to sign up to a belief system first. It may lead you to one, it may not, but it's based on experience. And indeed, all religions are ultimately based on experience. The Buddha didn't arrive at his enlightenment by studying books or going to advanced courses or doing PhDs. He arrived at it by meditating and sitting under a Bodhi tree where the enlightenment happened as an experience. Jesus didn't get there through lots of study and PhD courses, it was through experience. And that's the case in all the founders of religion and spiritual traditions. Well, now I want to say a little bit about rituals. All religions have rituals. And the one whole category of rituals are rituals of remembrance, where people reenact an original foundation story of their group. For example, In the Jewish Passover ritual, enacted every year at Passover, there's a reenacting of the Passover dinner of the people of Israel in Egypt on the last night that they were slaves in Egypt before they started their journey through the wilderness into the Promised Land. They killed a lamb, smeared the blood on the doorway of their house, and then they were passed over as the pyre of destruction swept over the land and killed the firstborn sons of the Egyptians and the firstborn of their cattle. So reenacting that meal is what the Passover dinner is. They have to eat lamb with bitter herbs. It's a ritual meal. And they tell the story of the Passover. And by taking part in this ritual, people affirm their Jewish identity and their connection with everyone who's done it over the generations right back to the first time. The Christian Holy Communion, itself a Passover dinner, is a reenactment of Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples. And again, by doing this as a ritual act, it connects people with all those who've done it before. The American Thanksgiving dinner is an example of a national ritual where Americans reenact the first Thanksgiving dinner. I think it was 1621, when the settlers in New England survived their first year and had this Thanksgiving dinner to give thanks for it. And every year since then, they've had this Thanksgiving dinner, which is a really big deal for Americans. It's even bigger than Christmas in many families. Whereas it means very little to those of us who aren't American. By taking part in it, they affirm their identity as Americans and connect with all those who've been settlers in America before. But why is it that in rituals, people believe it has to be done the same way it was done before? They often involve ritual languages which are highly conservative. The Coptic Church in Egypt has ancient Egyptian in its liturgy. The Brahminic rituals of India are in Sanskrit, the old language. Why do people have these very conservative attitude to rituals? Well, I think that there's an explanation in the form of morphic resonance, which is my own theory of memory and nature. I'll very briefly summarize it. It's the idea that there's a kind of inherent memory in nature. The so-called laws of nature are more like habits. Each species has a kind of collective memory. Each member of the species tunes in to what past members have done, and it affects their form and their behavior. So a giraffe embryo tunes into the forms of previous giraffes and becomes giraffe-like. And when it's born, it has giraffe instincts from the collective memory of giraffes. We have a collective memory too, which the psychologist Jung called the collective unconscious. Now, I think that this, the principle behind all this is what I call morphic resonance, the resonance of similar patterns of activity with subsequent similar patterns of activity in self-organizing systems. Normally, this works to create habits, but in rituals, people are deliberately doing things in as similar way as possible, creating the conditions for morphic resonance. They don't put it that way, but that's what's happening. So by doing a ritual, you're actually tuning in across time to all those who've done it before, which is exactly what people doing these rituals think they're doing. And by morphic resonance, that's just what would be happening. So these rituals make sense, and it's the reason that people use these ancient languages is because it's believed that those have the right resonance with what's been done before. And that's why there's this deeply conservative quality to rituals. When people bring about reforms in ritual, as in the Second Vatican Council, the Roman Catholic Church underwent a series of reforms, for example. When people reform rituals, they don't say, hey guys, let's do it a new way. They say, let's go back to an even more ancient form, the original form which was lost. So they nearly always claim some ancient roots for the new ritual. They don't just say, we just made this up. Because I think they depend on what I call the presence of the past. There are certain rituals which are rites of passage. In all cultures, there are rites of passage for birth and marriage and death. Death is a rite of passage. You're going from one state of being to another. And there are also often rites of passage for adolescents as they go from puberty to adulthood. Those rites of passage often involve trials by ordeal or some state of danger. And the symbolism of them is usually of death and rebirth. You die to your old role in society. You're born in a new way. Vision quests in North America, among North American Indians, are of this kind. Young men would go into the wilderness fasting for days, and in a situation of great danger, some of them didn't come back. It was a serious time of trial and ordeal, and during that period in the wilderness on their own, fasting, the idea was they'd tune into the world of the spirit and have some vision as to what they would do in their lives as they came back as adults and were welcomed into the social circle as men. Women's rites of passage are always different, of course, because they have different roles. Well, I think the best known rite of passage in the Christian tradition is baptism. And this is something which John the Baptist was doing in the River Jordan. Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. As it so happens, I just come back from Jordan. I was there on Sunday, and I had the great honor and pleasure of going to the original baptism site in the River Jordan on a pilgrimage. What we know about death and rebirth experiences is that for many people it's literal. Lots of people have near-death experiences where they die and then they come back to life. And there's been many scientific studies of these now, and they happen more commonly than they've ever happened before because of medical improvements and resuscitation techniques. So they've become much commoner than they ever were, near-death experiences. I dare say you've all read about them or know something of them. Very often people feel themselves floating out of their body, going through a tunnel into the light, and find themselves among beings of light, a feeling of great peace and joy. And then they have to come back because it's only a near-death experience. But often when people have had that experience, their lives are changed by it. They often say they're a different person, they no longer fear death, they've completely changed. And studies of people who've had these experiences in medical settings show transformations are very profound in many cases. Now, my particular theory, I mean, this is not a thing you'll read in books, but what makes sense to me is the idea that John the Baptist was actually inducing near-death experiences by drowning. He held people under in the River Jordan, and the usual interpretation, it was just symbolic of death by drowning and rebirth. But why have something that's just symbolic when for an extra couple of minutes you can have the real thing? I think that John the Baptist, it all makes total sense if that's what was going on. Now, of course, he may have lost a few, but that was before health and safety and liability litigation. So I think it was an industrial scale thing. People were going streaming there to the Jordan from all over, Jesus among them. And he held them under, they came up, and their lives were changed. And I imagine there would have been a team of people resuscitating them in a queue on the bank, and you sort of, next please. And it only takes a few minutes. And it would have been totally transformative. Within a few generations of the early church, they'd abandoned baptism by total immersion for most people, and children were baptized as infants by sprinkling water on them, whereas obviously it is just symbolic in that case. But in the ferment of the Reformation, when there were all these radical religious groups sprang up all over Europe, one particular group rediscovered this by reading the Bible, the Anabaptists. Ana means again, and they said it's wrong just to do baptism by total immersion. All over Northern Europe there were these Baptist groups who were baptizing people by total immersion in rivers and lakes. And they were filled with fervour. The Baptists were by far the most radical of all the people in the Reformation. And the individual members of this group were expected to have this experience of life and death and rebirth. They were born again, and they went round saying they were born again. And people make fun of it, oh, they're just using this language. Actually, I think it makes tremendous sense if they actually were having this experience of being born again. They would have had the sense of, had a near-death experience, come back to life and seen everything completely differently in an experience that lasted only a few minutes. I think that that's one reason why in the modern world so many people still need this kind of transformative experience, and why so many teenagers take psychoactive drugs, because some of them give death and rebirth experiences, particularly dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which lasts only a few minutes. It's the most intense of all the psychedelics. And many people who've taken it, including me, have had near-death type experiences with DMT. Some people have them on LSD. I think the fact our society doesn't really provide adequate rites of passage with this death and rebirth experience has led to a kind of jungle of so often ill-advised psychedelic experimentation, where it's not done properly with proper guides and people who look after you and welcome you into the group after you've done it, but in most unsuitable circumstances, with dodgy drugs in clubs and things, with loud music. There are people, though, who are doing it in a proper initiatory way, and I'm referring here to the psychedelic churches of Brazil. There are several psychedelic churches in Brazil. The best known is Santo Daime. There's another one called União do Vegetal, Union of Plants. And these are churches which have taken up the use of ayahuasca, which is a shamanic high psychedelic brew found in the Amazon, and incorporated into a Christian ceremony. They treat it as a communion. It starts with everyone chanting the Hail Mary and the Our Father, and then people go up one by one where there's kind of chalice, and the person in charge of the ceremony gives it them drink this brew, and then the whole group undergoes this journey together. It's not sort of individual tripping out, it's a kind of collective ceremony, which is extraordinarily powerful. And there are a lot of these churches functioning in Britain. They're underground, but there are several in London, they're in Oxford and Cambridge and so on. They're all over Europe. It's illegal, so that's why you don't see it advertised on the internet. But a lot of young people have actually had these experiences, both in these ayahuasca churches and also through shamanically guided ayahuasca ceremonies. Most people who do ayahuasca do it in this ceremonial form with somebody who knows about it and is responsible and can actually help them through it. So this is better than just tripping on psychedelics with inexperienced people in unsuitable circumstances. So there's a beginning of a responsible use of psychedelics in rites of passage. And I think that this is bound to grow. There's now a new resurgence of research on, legal research on psychedelics. I think we're in the beginning of a whole psychedelic renaissance at the moment. And I think it's best to recognize that this provides a tremendous opportunity for spiritual transformation rather than just seeing it as a disaster. It's a disaster in its present form for many people, but the potential for something really important is there. But finally, I just want to say a few words about pilgrimage. In all cultures in the world, there are pilgrimages. Muslims go to Mecca, Hindus go to Mount Kailash, Sikhs go to Amritsar, Jews go to Jerusalem, and so do Christians, so do Muslims. There are many kinds of pilgrimage. And in all these traditions, people go to these holy places. The historical background, I think, is that our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. All of us had hunter-gatherer ancestors. And hunter-gatherers have to move around. The animals they're hunting don't come to them, and the plants they're eating don't come to them. They have to move around as the seasons change. And they have pathways through the countryside, and they have sacred places at which they stop and where they tell the stories and have rituals. The Australian Aborigines call them songlines. When people settled, the Neolithic Revolution settled in villages and cities, this urge to travel, I think, was still there, which is why they had ceremonial centres. Stonehenge here in England and our other stone circles were not temples in the middle of cities. They were places to which people went for festivals, like the summer solstice. And it was a kind of pilgrimage to the temple or to the centre and then going back again. And in medieval Europe there were countless pilgrimage routes. The most famous in England was Canterbury, and in Chaucer's book The Canterbury Tales, written around 1380, 1390, there are these stories told by pilgrims to each other as they go from London to Canterbury. And people were going to Canterbury from all over. Walsingham, the Shrine of Our Lady, the Black Madonna of Walsingham in Norfolk was another major one, and there are many other places that were major sites of pilgrimage here. In Ireland, the holy mountain Croagh-Patrick in County Mayo was and still is a major place of pilgrimage, and the holy lake, Lough Derg. Well, this is part of our nature in all traditions, pilgrimage. But at the Reformation in England and in other reformed countries, pilgrimage was suppressed. In 1538, Thomas Cromwell issued an injunction against pilgrimage, forbidding pilgrimage. And when they nationalised and closed down the monasteries, they destroyed the infrastructure for pilgrimage, because pilgrims stayed at the monasteries, provided places to sleep and had food on their journey. The shrines were desecrated. The image of the Black Madonna of Walsingham was burned in a public bonfire. So there was this tremendous change that the Reformation brought about in the practice, religious practice in Protestant countries. I think it left a vacuum in the soul of the English, and I think that's one reason why, after a few generations, the English invented tourism. I think tourism is best seen as a form of secularized pilgrimage. Tourists still go to the great sacred places, the temples of Egypt and India, the sacred mountains, the great cathedrals, and so on, the ancient sacred sites like Stonehenge and Avebury. But when they get there, they don't really know what to do. They have to pretend they're modern people and they're primarily interested in art history. So guides spring up to fill them with facts that go in one ear and out the other. They can't sort of kneel down or say a prayer or light a candle because they're secular modern people. Actually, it's more like frustrated pilgrimage, this kind of tourism. If you go on a real pilgrimage, you can go with an intention. You say a prayer, you light a candle, you can make an offering. If you go to a Hindu temple, you offer food which is blessed by the Brahmin, and as it's called prasad, and then you bring that back and you share it with your family and your friends when you get home. But if you're a tourist, all you can do is take photographs, and your friends and family aren't necessarily that interested in seeing lots of your tourist family photos and snapshots. So if you haven't had a blessing yourself, you can't share it with others when you get home. So I think the simplest paradigm shift here is to shift back from tourism to pilgrimage. And there's an astonishing revival of pilgrimage going on in Europe at the moment. The most famous of all is Santiago de Compostela. That was revived in the 1980s by a group of enthusiasts who re-established the infrastructure along the route so people could walk there. And in 1987, 1,000 people walked to Santiago de Compostela. Last year, it was 300,000. And these are not just devout Catholics. There are a lot of atheists, agnostics, people from other religious traditions. Here in Britain, there's a revival of pilgrimage going on right now with the British Pilgrimage Trust, which is reopening the ancient footpath pilgrimage routes across the countryside, not on roads, to Canterbury and other ancient sacred sites. And the British Pilgrimage Trust website will give you the details. There's at least 30 great pilgrimage routes in Britain that are detailed there. And they also lead weekend pilgrimages or one-day pilgrimages. If you want to go on and you're not used to it, it's helpful to learn the ropes. One of the simple things that I learned myself in India is, I lived in India for 7 years, is that when you go on a pilgrimage to a Hindu temple, you don't just walk straight in. You walk round it first, clockwise, because by walking circumambulating it, you make it the centre. And it then it feels quite different when you enter it after you've circled it first. And now when I go to cathedrals here in England, I do that, and I find it's a much more satisfactory way of relating to the place. Every year, I've been on quite a few pilgrimages myself in India, on the continent, and here in Britain. Every year I go on a pilgrimage with a teenage godson of mine. It started when he was 14. I couldn't think what to give him, and I stopped giving people stuff because most people have got too much stuff. So I try and give experiences. And I thought, what would be suitable? So I thought, okay, I'll offer him pilgrimage. We go on the last 8 miles of the Pilgrim's Way to Canterbury. We take a train. We walk through fields, woods, orchards, and we go to the Black Prince's Well, a healing well near Canterbury. We go to the cathedral, we circumambulate it. We light candles at the shrine of St. Thomas a Becket. We have a cream tea, and then we go to choral evensong. There's beautiful music filling the cathedral every evening. And I said, would you like to do that? And I didn't know what he'd say, but he said, yes. And so every year we've done that, Canterbury, and then the next year it was Ely. We walked along the River Cam from Waterbeach. Then the year after that it was Lincoln. Then last year it was Wells. This year it'll probably be Winchester or Salisbury. We haven't decided yet. It'll be in June. Anyway, pilgrimage is a wonderful way to relate to the land, which is healthy, be outdoors, healthy, get exercise, scientifically proven to be healthy, doing something with an objective which is healthy, a purposeful activity is a healthy thing to do. And it has wonderfully transformative effects on many people. And I think it's also, one of the points the British Pilgrimage Trust makes is that for people who've come to England from elsewhere, it's a very, very good way of linking to the land of England. Because otherwise, when people immigrate, they usually go to cities, and they link to the city, and their idea of the countryside is back home, their village in Jamaica, or their village in the Punjab, or their village in West Africa. They don't link to the land of England, and you can't really be rooted in this place unless you link to the land, and pilgrimage is a really good way of doing that. And the British Pilgrimage Trust finds that quite a number of people who go on these pilgrimages are people whose roots are elsewhere. They find it an immensely powerful way of linking to the land here. And the same goes for any country. Well, that gives you an overview of just a few of these practices. Every one of them is something that anyone can do. Pilgrimage is the only one that might actually cost something. But you can do it quite cheaply if you camp, or if you just do a one-day pilgrimage, it's practically free. So I think we're in this extraordinarily interesting situation at the moment where we now have access to spiritual traditions from all different traditions all over the world, and they can be explored in a new way, that we can do them within or outside a religious framework, and it's up to us. And everyone can be included, and I only deal with 7 practices here. There are more. This is only a selection. But these are all things that are enjoyable to do and good for you. So that's just a brief overview, and now there's time for questions.
My question is why you don't say anything more or endorse the ideas of David Bohm more in terms of support of your morphic resonance and psychic phenomena, etc.
Not everyone will know about David Bohm, so I have to say 1 or 2 words. David Bohm was an eminent quantum physicist who had an idea of the implicate order. Behind the world we see, there's an implicate order of quantum processes which is invisible. And he spent many years in dialogues with Krishnamurti, the Indian teacher. And I had dialogues with both Krishnamurti and David Bohm, the 3 of us together, and I did a lot with Bohm and also with Krishnamurti. Some of these are online. His approach to quantum physics fitted very well with my own ideas about morphic resonance, and he was actually a big supporter of the idea of morphic resonance. In the new edition of my book, A New Science of Life, there's a dialogue between me and Bohm about morphic resonance and the implicate order, which I put it there so it was more readily available. So the one reason I don't talk that much about Bohm is because lots of people haven't heard of him. And if I'm going to talk about how Bohm relates to this, I have to give a little disquisition on quantum theory first. And that's sort of a bit beside the point of what I'm doing at the moment. But when it comes to understanding how these kinds of processes relate to the microphysical world, then I think Bohm's ideas are some of the best we've got. So I'm very keen on his work. But unfortunately, most physicists don't follow Bohm's approach to quantum physics. No one's ever shown anything wrong with it. It just doesn't fit their normal habits of thinking. He was too holistic, I think, in his thinking, too inclusive. And a lot of them think all you need to do is just calculate and get the answer. Don't ask too many questions. That's the general attitude.
Thank you very much.
He was a deep thinker, and that's not something that goes over too well in most academic circles.
Hi, I'm Beatrice. Thanks for the talk. I'm interested if you have any examples about how we can think about future generations more effectively, because it seems like, particularly now here in the West, it's not something that we're very good at doing, and perhaps there might be examples of previous generations or other cultures that do that better.
Most traditional societies are sort of taken for granted that what they're in is part of a continuity, that the rituals they do, for example, link them to their ancestors and also to those who will come afterwards. And so there's always been this sense of continuity, that we're part of a flow from generation to generation. We're in a new situation, really, everybody. I mean, traditional religions have not had to deal with this problem because we don't know what's going to happen. There's such an uncertainty about the future of our relation to the earth and to each other and to enormous populations and to global warming and exhaustion of resources. I don't think there are any sort of ready-made traditional practices for this unique situation we're in. And I must admit I haven't thought very much about it myself in terms of what kinds of things one might be able to do in terms of the spiritual practice. I mean, obviously, we all have to do what we can in terms of not wasting things and not polluting the atmosphere and all that kind of thing. All those things are immensely important, and I support various activist groups myself that are engaged with this, but it all seems rather small things to do compared with the size of the problems. I think the main thing is if we despair, then we become totally ineffective. We have to have the faith that things can get better and the hope that they can, and that is in itself empowering. And many of these spiritual practices, by giving us a sense of connection with a world greater than ourselves, are empowering. If we feel disconnected, we're disempowered. If we feel this connection that comes through all these practices to something greater than ourselves, there's the sense that can increase our faith and hope that things can get better and perhaps even empower us to be more effective in what we do.
Thank you very much for your talk, Rupert. So I kind of wanted to touch a bit on what you were saying about psychedelic rituals, just because I think for me, I know plenty of people, myself included, who've used psychedelics to get in touch with something spiritual and connect, but then perhaps have lost that connection, and so have become very disconnected with how to make change and do things in this world. How do you work between psychedelics being used as learning rather than escape? Because I feel like there's a really fine line there with people using it to escape from what's present now.
Yes, I agree. It's a very difficult question, isn't it? And at present, where many people do it in a way that's completely uncontrolled and undisciplined, then I think it often is an escape. I think one of the things about these psychedelic churches is that it's done as part of a practice, a regular ongoing spiritual practice. And the people I know who go to them, it's not as they're doing it sort of every week. They may do it once or twice a year. And it acts as an inspirational something that charges their spiritual batteries, as it were. The people I know who do psychedelics most responsibly don't do it very frequently and treat it as a kind of sacrament that they do relatively infrequently as part of a larger spiritual perspective, not putting all their eggs in the psychedelic basket, but having this as a way of touching these other realms of experience and being inspired by them and empowered by them. And then combining that with other practices like meditation and so on. So I think it's not a practice on its own, but only in combination with other things. Well, it's a bit like pilgrimage in the sense very few people go on pilgrimage all the time. You do it now and then, and it can be very effective when you do it and sort of help you in the rest of your life.
Have you ever thought of being a campaigner? Like, let's bring back hymn singing in schools every morning at 9 o'clock and things like that. We had a culture where every child sang every morning, and that's all gone. And
well, some schools still do it. Mainly church schools. In secular schools it's difficult because if you sing a hymn, then Jewish parents object, say, oh, it's a Christian hymn, or Muslim parents say, we don't want that, and atheist parents say, oh, you shouldn't do that. The trouble is that it's very hard to do in most schools. Nevertheless, when our own children were quite small, when they were at primary school, they went to New End Primary School in Hampstead, which is a state school, not a church school. I discovered that they were simply not singing. None of these children were singing because they hadn't got a music teacher. There'd been some cuts, and the first thing to go is music. They had to concentrate on maths and reading and stuff. So my wife and I volunteered. I used to go in once a week and take the assembly, and I play the piano. And I taught them songs every week. I got a book of children's songs. Ones were telling stories that were sort of vaguely, one about Noah built the ark and that sort of thing, that were related to the Judeo-Christian tradition, but not in a way that would put off atheists or Jewish people. The kids absolutely loved it. And they weren't getting any musical education. One day there'd been an international football match, and England had won rather rarely, and I played, the next day I played the national anthem, and I said, can anyone tell me what that tune is? Out of 120 children, 3 hands went up. One was my own son, and I knew he knew. And I asked another child, and she said, oh, I think it's the theme tune of a TV series. And I said, well, no, not exactly. And then I asked the other little boy there, and he said, I'm in the Cub Scouts. And he said, I think it's called the national anthem. And I said, right, it is called the national anthem. And I taught them the national anthem. Nobody had taught them the national anthem. People assume that they already know it, but most children now know nothing about any religious tradition, or national tradition for that matter. It's assumed in a secular world you shouldn't impose anything on people, so they don't learn these things. I think singing, and then my wife Jill, who teaches chanting, and went in and she got them all chanting, and they loved that. And she does overtone chanting, and she got them all chanting together. And then our children's last term at school, we discovered underneath New End School in Hampstead, there's this well, a spring, the source of the Fleet River, or one of the sources of the Fleet River. And I'd read about it in books, and I asked the headmistress if we could see it, and she rather reluctantly got the caretaker to open the door. We went down these steps, and there in this Victorian vaults, these vaults, and this big space, like from here to the door there, is of pure water, with all vaulted over, with it's coming out of the ground, and the caretaker said it went up and down, depending on when it rained and so on. And it was this spring at the base of the school, and that term as their project they were doing water. So we said to the headmistress, well, the children would probably like to know about this spring and well, and so Jill and I, at the end of term, did this ceremony where I was playing the piano, we got them all singing, we talked about the well, and then Jill led them in a water spirit song, and we led them down to the well. They went one by one. I had a big bag of pennies, so I gave each of them a penny. So when they got to the well, they could spend a little time with all around them people chanting, and they could throw in their coin and make a wish. And this had an enormous effect on the children. In fact, our host here, the young woman who runs or owns 42 acres, was at school at that time. She says it's the thing she remembers most from her time at school there. I think there's a huge potential. Children need a kind of magic and connection and chanting in their lives. And in this grimly utilitarian educational system, they're not getting it. Just more tests and more sort of grimly reading, writing and arithmetic-based education. So I think it's terribly important for children to sing.
I just wonder what you think about actually greeting people, because I think that's one of the most extraordinary things that we can offer each other.
Greeting.
Greeting, yeah, the ritual of greeting.
Greeting people and saying goodbye. These are actually rituals, and in my book I have a section on rituals of greeting and parting, because every culture has their own way of doing it, and it's extremely important. And the basic form of greeting is really an expression of peace. So I've just come back from Jordan, and everywhere I went, the standard Arab greetings, salam alaikum, peace be with you, alaikum salam. You know the response. And shalom in the Jewish tradition is peace. This greetings of shaking hands is a ritual greeting which shows you haven't got a dagger in your hand. You're making contact. Kissing is an expression of sharing breath together. So all these are very, very important, and every culture has them. And then when we part, the traditional thing is blessings. Like goodbye. Most people don't know what goodbye means. It means God be with you. It's the shortened form of God be with you. So every time we say goodbye, we're giving a blessing. And if we're more aware of it, we can give it more effectively. And even those greetings that are like Auf Wiedersehen, see you again, it's really a prayer for being preserved until you meet again, or see you soon, or arrivederci, or au revoir. These are all forms of farewell which connect one. And some are directly committing people to God. Adieu in French, adieu. Adieu means obviously to God, and adios. So I think that these traditional greetings, all have this sense of connecting us with each other, but in the framework of a larger spiritual reality. And again, the problem in a modern secular world is that a lot of people, militant atheists, object to anything involving God. But then I think the onus is on them to come up with other greetings that they are happy with. But I think greetings and partings are, in every culture, very important. They create the field of the relationship and establish the link right from the beginning.
I was just saying thank you for the talk. I would quite like to hear your definition of what spirituality is, and I'll leave it at that, because your practices are very wide-ranging. They have different objectives, different expressions, different endpoints, let's say. So I'd like to understand from you, what is your definition of spirituality, and why these are spiritual practices?
I think that for me, the definition would be that it's connecting with a form of consciousness greater than our own. In all traditions, there's a belief that there are different forms of consciousness greater than our own. In shamanic cultures, there's spirits, there's animal spirits, and there's earth spirits, and sky spirits, and so on. In Buddhism, which is often described as atheistic, they have, at least Tibetan Buddhism, they have gods and goddesses and dakinis and so on, as well as the ultimate state of consciousness in nirvana. In the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Islamic tradition, you have innumerable angels and spirits as well, and saints, who you can pray to, because they're also spirits. And then there's God, and in the Christian tradition, God comes in three modes: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and you can pray to God as God the Father, like in Our Father, or as God the Son, praying to Jesus, or God the Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit, like in invocations like "Come, Holy Ghost, our souls inspire." So there's many, and you can pray to saints, like "Hail Mary, full of grace." And there's all of these forms of practice are to do with connecting with levels of consciousness beyond our own, and they're all to do with connection. So meditation is about connecting with the ground of consciousness. For an atheist or a materialist, they'd say, oh yes, we're doing that, but it's in our brains, it's not beyond our brains. But they still call it spiritual. Sam Harris calls his book about meditation a spiritual practice. So it's slightly, the definition's slightly muddied by the fact that atheists call them spiritual practices but don't believe in anything beyond their own consciousness. But for the traditional meanings, it's all about connecting with something beyond yourself. So all prayers begin with invocations to the spirit to whom you're praying. Our Father, Hail Mary, Om Namah Shivaya, or whatever. Then connecting with the more than human world, connecting with nature, is really the sense of connecting with the much greater world of nature than we are ourselves. And anyone who's from any religious tradition thinks of the natural world as pervaded by consciousness, not just mechanical collisions between atoms and so on. So that's again a connection with something greater than ourselves. Singing and chanting connects us with each other, and also if it's sort of spiritual chanting or singing with, it's a kind of prayer or thanksgiving to a consciousness greater than our own. Pilgrimage is a journey to a holy place, and holy places are traditionally seen as places which are bridges between heaven and earth. That's why they often have this vertical dimension. They have kind of like minarets or obelisks or spires or towers. And these are literally places that connect heaven and earth, because these tall structures get struck by lightning much more than anything else. So they actually literally conduct the energy of the sky into the ground. That's why they all have lightning conductors. And so what they all have in common is this sense of connecting with a greater consciousness than our own. And that sense of connection makes us feel that we belong, we're connected, we're part of something bigger than ourselves. The sense of disconnection makes us feel separate and alone and generally miserable. And which is why these spiritual practices, although they're completely different, each one I talked about is very different from all the others, what they have in common is this ability to connect us.
I'm very keen to hear your experiences of what you're doing now as a meditative practice and how that differs from TM, and what was the reason for switching as well as a lifelong meditator.
Well, I've tried various forms of meditation. I started with TM, and then when I went to live in India, I tried other forms of Hindu meditation, different mantras. Then for a while I was living in Hyderabad, and it was traditionally a rather Muslim city, and I learned Urdu, and I had a Sufi teacher for a year. I did a Sufi mantra for a year. A wazifa, it's very similar. It's the basic same principle. Then later in my time in India, I found this amazing Christian holy man called Father Bede Griffiths, a Benedictine monk who lived in an ashram in Tamil Nadu in the south of India. And I spent 2 years living in his ashram. I wrote my first book, A New Science of Life, there. And I was drawn back to the Christian tradition when I was in India, which was the opposite of what I'd expected. He was a wonderful teacher because it was sort of grounded both in a deep understanding of Eastern and Western philosophy and spiritual traditions. And I adopted a Christian form of meditation using a Christian mantra. But it's essentially, that's what I do now, essentially similar. to these other forms, different mantras. I've also done Vipassana type meditation, mindfulness meditation, but I personally find mantra-based meditation works better for me. It also works better if you chant the mantra out loud. Most people are taught to run before they can walk. They're taught a mantra you do silently. But actually, as my wife Jill shows in her workshops, chanting these mantras out loud is much easier because you hear the mantra, you produce it, you hear it, it fills your mind, fills your body with vibration. So sometimes when I'm meditating, I chant the mantra out loud. And of course you can't always do that if there's other people around and stuff, but I find that chanting, I was doing that this morning, I just decided to do it out loud this morning, which I usually do it silently, and confirmed again that it's actually much more powerful to do it out loud.
Thanks.
As you're talking about the Jewish story of Passover, and as well about the national anthem in the UK, going back to ancient meaningful stories that we were taught, whatever background you come from, it doesn't escape me that a lot of them celebrate the community, yes, but it's often against the other. So the Jewish Passover, as well as celebrating their own community, they're also celebrating killing the Egyptian kids.
Yes.
And also the national anthem, it is celebrating of us against the other. So it appeals to racial values, tribal values, and ethnocentric values. Do you have any thoughts about a meaningful story for the future, a new human myth that we can teach our kids? I mean, it's in the current chaos, we're all from different backgrounds in the faces of each other. We do retract our own ancient ideas, and we feel safer there. Do you have any thoughts about the new story, what we should tell our kids? I understand the appeal of the Muslim pilgrimage, the beauty of churches, the beauty of the ancient traditions, but there is a lot of hostility seeds within those traditions that makes me understand the new secularist revulsion towards them.
If we cut ourselves off from our traditional roots, then we're literally uprooted, deracinated, and detached. So I don't think that's a good solution. But I think that finding a more inclusive story is a very important part of what we're doing, or what we should be doing. The problem is that secularists who are very hot on saying what's wrong with religion are not so good at coming up with positive solutions that have a spiritual dimension, because many of them are against the world of the spirit. As atheists, they're not all atheists, but secular humanists often are. It's difficult. The communists tried to create a universal brotherhood of humans that left behind all these religions and was totally international. The whole point, the communist anthem was called The International. It was about embracing everyone in this new secular story. The trouble is that it turned into being something even more vicious and violent than anything before in any religion. Stalin's Russia and Mao Zedong's China and Pol Pot's Cambodia. All of them were trying to establish a new story, but they did it in a way that was actually worse than anything that had gone before. And secular humanists acknowledge that we need rituals, so they have humanist celebrants for weddings and funerals and things. But when I've been to these, they're not very engaging or powerful, because they have to be done in such a way that there's no spiritual dimension. It's just about us as people. So I think the challenge, which no one's actually, there are universal religions that try and include all the others. Theosophy, for example, says it'll include all the other religions in some great overarching structure. But that's been around for well over 100 years and hasn't really succeeded, or at least on a large scale. So I think this is a major challenge, and I think one way of doing it is through people praying together. Another way of doing it might be through people going on pilgrimages together to, say, to endangered forests or to places of great natural beauty. But of course all of those are going to be in particular places with their own history. Anything in England is rooted in English history, anything in Arabia is rooted in Arab history, anything in India is rooted in Indian history. So it's difficult to deracinate ourselves, uproot ourselves from our traditions. Yet I think we have to try and find ways of doing it in these non-hostile manner insofar as we can. There's no simple solution that I've come up with.
My question kind of follows on from that. I was going to ask whether you feel that there's a risk in this need to validate everything in our modern scientific language, or in this example, to leave behind the ills of the past, that we actually dilute down what were once much more intense practices, in this kind of like assumption and hubris that in our modern intelligence we can understand the primitive past entirely, and actually in the process throw some babies out with the bathwater as we try to reinvent it. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we're in a difficult situation in Western countries, particularly in Western Europe, that most people have thrown out all the babies with all the bathwater. Most children are brought up with no religious faith, knowledge, perspective. Most children who come from traditionally Christian backgrounds, most people who are atheists or have no religion in this country are from Christian backgrounds, not from Muslim or Sikh or Hindu backgrounds. Christianity has a unique distinction among religions in giving rise to atheism far more than any other religion does. And it may just be a historical accident, but it may also be that it includes a very strong emphasis on the idea of truth, and you've got to have something that's true, and so then you quarrel with other people that it's not true. Whereas most religions focus on practice rather than belief. And in practice, Christianity does too. In Judaism, it's a matter of orthopractice, going to the synagogue on these days, not eating pork and all that kind of thing, rather than what you believe. Doesn't matter what you believe. It's like in traditional Irish Catholicism, doesn't matter that much what you believe as long as you don't eat fish on meat on Fridays and give things up for Lent and so on. So most religions are based on what's called the principle of orthopractice, correct practice. And Christianity has been more than most on orthodoxy, correct belief or teaching. But as a result of this, anyway, the majority of people in Britain today have no religious practice. Children have no religious upbringing or minimal religious education at school, where they're just taught a bit of every religion as a kind of comparative religion course called religious education. And so it's not as if one's throwing out anything in that kind of situation. Is any spiritual practice is more than what was there before if you start from a baseline of almost nothing. So and most people who are starting from that baseline of almost nothing are not going to sign up for a full-on, Islamic conversion or conversion to full-on Catholic conversion. A few do, but that's not going to be a mass path for most people. An undiluted, completely rigorous, unmodified version of the old religions. That's why we're in this extraordinarily unparalleled situation. And I myself feel that through spiritual practices, people can become more aware of that sense of connection and more aware of it, the role it can play in their own lives. And they may feel then, on the basis of that experience, that they want some kind of deeper connection with tradition. Or they may find some way of moving towards some completely new form of inclusive spirituality that we were just considering the possibility of. But I don't think that, I think that the scientific validation of these things in the past wasn't important to people. They just did them because the practices were there and they were traditional. In the modern world, there's been so much anti-Christian and anti-religious propaganda from atheists for something like 200 years, ever since the late 18th century, that a lot of people grow up with the idea religions are toxic, they just do nothing but cause problems, they're really bad for people, they cause wars, they're they're based on people being duped and deceived by manipulative priests and so on. There's a very, very negative image that a lot of people have. So they stop having any religious practices. So I think it's a matter of rediscovery. Most people nowadays have to rediscover whether they want to be connected to traditional pathways or not. And it's an unprecedented situation historically, and no one knows where it'll go. So I think, it's completely open, the future. I myself think it's very important for the existing traditions to continue because they have teachings they can impart, and if everyone gives up everything and everything's just a kind of salad of a bit of this, a bit of Native American this and an Indian joss stick here and a dream catcher there, and like going into a shop in Glastonbury where there's all these, statue of Merlin there, and then it just becomes not very serious, rather superficial, a kind of mix and match approach. So.
Thank you.
Secondly, I would like to thank our hosts for this talk, 42 Acres, beautiful co-working and event space. Many of the team are here tonight, and they very generously allow us to hold these monthly talks here, and the idea is for us to form a community of like-minded people and to be stimulated from thought-provoking speakers. So thanks to 42 Acres. If you would like to find out more about them, do sign up for their newsletter when you leave and take one of these flyers for details of more talks in this series. Finally, I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight, because without you, we wouldn't have a community. And so I want to thank you for supporting the work of the Resurgence Trust by being here tonight. And I now just want to speak for a couple of minutes about the Resurgence Trust, which I work for. In a nutshell, we're an environmental educational charity, and we do three key things. We publish Resurgence and Ecologist magazine 6 times a year. We run the Ecologist website as a free service, and we organise many events. As well as these monthly talks, we hold an annual summer camp, a festival of wellbeing, and lots of other things. More details of all our activities can be found on resurgence.org. I've put over on the table some complimentary copies of the magazine and also some membership forms, so do sign up. It's £30 for a year and you'd get details of all our activities. And I've also put flyers about some of our forthcoming events and some of my cards if you'd like to talk to me further and engage with anything, how you can help us, etc. Finally, if you've been inspired by what Rupert has said tonight, he's brought some of his books here to sell, which are £15 and £10 each, and he's happy to sign them for you. Ruby, can you just stand up and wave? Ruby will take some money if anyone wants to buy a book. And we can stay here for another half an hour, so do carry on those conversations you had at the beginning of the evening, and thank you.